We're excited about the Canadian Municipal Network's efforts to prevent crime in Canada. And one of the concepts that has become critical in communicating what is crime prevention is calling it Upstream. Now, Upstream means a number of things. It means that it's evidence-based, that it's people-centered and early intervention. And we get those phrases from Upstream Action, the Canadian group that has been proposing things that are not just Band-Aids, not just repairing damage, but getting up before the damage is done. And for us, this means stopping criminal careers before they start. It means avoiding harm to potential victims by stopping victimization. It also means two very important different ways of doing crime prevention. One is general government policy that is trying to reduce unemployment, that's trying to build schools in poor areas, that is trying to invest in universal childcare. And we're very influenced by the Roundtree Foundation's research on this, which shows how much violent crime over time can be reduced by those government policies that improve well-being for everybody. The other sort of crime prevention is crime prevention that focuses very much on risk factors in problem places. So instead of trying to arrest your way out of crime in problem places, you're going after social risk factors. And the sorts of things that are necessary in upstream crime prevention in those problem places are actions in schools and universities, a lot of which can reduce sexual violence, gender-based violence, in families in problem places, including outreach to youth, in the health sector, particularly in emergency rooms. And yes, police services have a role in referring people to those services, but also with focused deterrence and being partners. And we also have a role for cities, for municipalities. Upstream crime prevention requires a much greater action, a new action, a transformation in the way that we deal with crime. And this requires municipalities to do a much better job of identifying and targeting causes and not just waiting till crime occurs. It requires politicians to insist on the use of proven strategies in cities, but also at the level of the province and the federal government. It requires police to shift to a much smarter, a much more intelligent way of policing and partnership policing, problem-oriented policing. And it requires legislators to establish boards we see as one of the keys to implementing upstream crime prevention, that there is a leadership center, a crime reduction board at all levels of government. And it particularly requires governments to invest adequate resources. The vision of the Canadian Municipal Network reflects a lot of what I've just said about upstream crime prevention. So it talks about safe, healthy, and inclusive Canadian communities that are free from crime and violence. It's important to note what is not upstream prevention. And these are actions that have had a lot of publicity. They're very popular. The media promotes these, but these are not what actually helps reduce crime. Two of the most famous ones that don't work are DARE. This was a program invented by the Los Angeles Police Department, and the evaluations showed that it actually increased the number of kids who use drugs. And unfortunately, this is still being used in Canada, but it is not prevention. Scared Straight is now the subject of TV series, and this also shows that when you take young kids into high security prisons and supposedly scare them, you don't actually solve their problems. So they actually get more involved in crime. Now, in contrast to upstream, there are some downstream actions that are important, and these include police and paramedics who respond to 911 calls on violence. These include police collaborating on hubs, on situation tables, what has been promoted very much by Dale McPhee and Saskatchewan, but exists across Ontario and increasingly other provinces. And there is a role for the courts and prisons. But we think this role is much more limited than currently. We think these are very expensive and relatively ineffective ways of dealing with crime. So amongst those expensive ways in Canada, the costs of policing really stand out for municipalities. So about 2/3 of all policing costs in Canada are paid by municipalities, and these costs have doubled in the last 10 or 15 years. And this really shrinks the police budget, the municipal budget, and makes it much harder for them to continue or increase the early interventions that upstream crime prevention, upstream proven crime prevention requires. We love this slide by the Minister of Finance from New Brunswick, which I think really summarizes what is upstream prevention. If in fact we did have a Preventions Canada, if we did have a preventions board at the national level and a similar board at the provincial levels and in the cities, we would need much less of Corrections Canada. I think it's a very important picture. So I'd like to turn to why crime prevention is essential. And first of all, I think it's important to see that despite long-term trends that have reduced crime, that we're still looking at levels of crime. Property crime, there will be one victim of a property crime for every 7 adults. That's from the 2014 survey. And when you look at violence, it will be 1 in 15. 1 in 15. This is fairly significant. If you look at the street on which you live, that means probably there will be, if you're an average street, that there will be 2 houses that will be broken into, or there'll be some type of theft, and there will be 1 person who will be the victim of the sort of violence covered in that survey. And if you accumulate all the costs of this sort of violence, you're looking at something of the order of $50 to $60 billion a year. And I want you to remember that figure, because for me, the most important reason to invest in upstream crime prevention is to reduce the harm to victims, the harm that destroys the quality of life for so many victims, that makes them feel insecure on their streets and in their homes. So I hear a lot of people talking about, oh, we have to build more prisons because there's overcrowding, or because there's too much solitary confinement. I hear people talking about hiring more judges and more prosecutors. I hear that we need to pay for more policing. And I hear about the overuse of incarceration for Indigenous people. And people are politicians are reacting to this by spending more. The last thing we need in 2017 is spending more on reaction to these. The solutions to rising police costs, the solution to overcrowding in jails, and particularly the solutions to overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison lie outside the criminal justice system. They lie in upstream prevention. Now, some people think that Canadians are all folk who want minimum penalties, longer periods in prison. They want people who commit crime to suffer. This, in fact, is a myth. For every Canadian who thinks the solution to crime are more police, more lawyers, more jails, there are 2 who think the solutions have to do with education and prevention. And that is very important. So politicians who do not feel sure about investing in prevention need to remember that. And the politicians who have actually gone for prevention, in Alberta, the Conservative Party in 2007 won an election on a significant investment in prevention and intervention. And this is true in other countries where politicians have decided that they want to be on the side of victims and of taxpayers and stop violence before it occurs. Canada must find more cost-effective ways to deal with crime, ways that are evidence-based, that are compassionate to victims and protect the public. The Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention has proposed 3 key actions. One is to establish offices for crime prevention in all orders of government. The second is to organize an annual conference so that people and agencies engaged in prevention can share their successes and can develop new solutions. The third is a partnership between federal, provincial, territorial governments and municipalities to ensure a serious investment in prevention. If these 3 actions occurred, costing the equivalent of 10% of what we currently are spending on reacting to crime, we could expect significant reductions in crime before 2030. 1 million fewer victims of assaults and violent crime, 2 million fewer victims of theft and property crime. This would save about 25 billion or more in harm to victims. The required investment is important, is 2 billion, but this would counterbalance the 6 billion that we have added in the last 15 years to the reaction budget, but would achieve potential savings in reaction costs of 4 billion or more annually.